Well, I think that we can discuss about two different scenarios right now, and I can consider that majority of our patients at the moment of first relapse will be refractory to lenalidomide, and maybe, yeah, basically today I would say that majority of them are going to be refractory to lenalidomide, and some of them Dara exposed. It's true that Dara is being incorporated as part of the first line of therapy, for example, with the Dara-Lendex, and we can discuss it later on, because I can imagine that the patients who started the treatment with Dara-Lendex, according to the median progression-free survival, they do continue on treatment right now, and they have not progressed yet. So first, if you want, we can proceed to discuss about the first rescue therapy in the LEN refractory population. And there will be, I would say, two different scenarios. Patient very sensitive to lenalidomide, so patient receiving lenalidomide for 4 or 5 years, and the patient relapse. And the second scenario would be patient not very sensitive to lenalidomide, that the patient is relapsing maybe in the first 2 years after starting len maintenance. So if you wanted to discuss how do you rescue, and maybe it would be good to have here the US and the European opinion, because maybe the management is exactly the same or not.
So I think in the rare len-sensitive patient, because almost everybody I think is on len until progression, in that rare patient that is not, or is so old in their treatment that it was before we started or used len maintenance, I think it's hard not to use len-Daradex. I think the POLLUX trial PFS is really tough to beat. And so I think that's where I would go. In the len-resistant patient, I think the use of Dara becomes the sort of primary agent. And then the question is, are you going to add a PI or an IMiD to it? And at least at our center, we have used PomDaraDex a lot in this situation. What we found when we presented data at ASH last year is that patients who were 3 years or less from diagnosis to relapse, the benefit of PomDaraDex was less. And so for those patients, we're actually using CAR-Daradex, but for everybody else, we're using PomDaraDex. But that's just our algorithm.
Yeah, we would be, I think, broadly similar, Marie-V, at the Dana. I mean, I think the important question is Dara exposure now. You know, if you've had Dara up front, what do you then do? And that's our biggest challenge now in the setting of quote unquote Dara failure, recognizing that that's uncommon, but it does occur. And then it's a question of when, you know, what kind of frequency of Dara use is in play. Is it monthly? Obviously, that's more usual. Or have they had prior Dara exposure and they say a year since Dara exposure, so not technically CD38 resistant. So that kind of feeds into it. But broadly, very similar principles to Sagar. We obviously do have protocols that address all of these different things in the research sense, but sort of mirroring those, we've been exploring how to bring BCMA targeted approaches earlier. And obviously we're engaging with CAR-T based approaches on protocol, realizing that per label you can't do that so soon. But mainstays of management of POM, if the patients had prior bortezomib CAR, if patients had prior CAR, we'll reach for, you know, how do we do believe in the PIs, we bring those in, you know, in depending on what's gone first and what comes second. And hitherto we've actually been fans of ixazomib in the appropriate patient. Ixazomib POM in our hands has performed quite well. Especially we've got a nice twice-a-week study actually right now from Omar, which is doing really nicely. But DaraPomDex we did as part of the alliance, and that we got a 21-month PFS. So, you know, we've had these oral approaches. I think another twist to this has been COVID. You know, in the COVID era, we've definitely liked these oral, you know, minimal visit type approaches. Obviously, that's changing now favorably, but nonetheless, COVID remains a real challenge for us, at least. So we bear that in mind. But broadly, very similar to Sagar's comments.
Well, actually, in Europe, we're doing quite the same. Of course, we always mention Dara, but I think in first line for those patients who are not exposed to Dara in first line, we also use ISA. So it might be good also to mention isatuximab, although it's given not subcutaneously. So we go for the few patients not being R exposed, not being Dara exposed to Dara-RD, of course, for all the patients. For those being R exposed, we use ISA or Dara-Kd as a preferential regimen. Also for those patients who are exposed but are not on Dara maintenance, of course, there are now patients who are using Dara all the time, so then we're not using that, and then we go to POM-based regimens. As you know, in the Netherlands, we also use a lot of cyclophosphamide. So when we use pomalidomide, we sometimes use it in combination with cyclophosphamide and prednisone instead of using ELO-PomDex, because when we're using ELO directly after Dara, we feel a little bit reluctant, first because there are no clinical data, and second because all the NK cells are gone after Dara, directly after Dara. So therefore we think that ELO might be less effective at that time, although clinical data supporting that are lacking. So then we use either POMVD, POM cyclophosphamide, prednisone instead of ELO-POMD.
Okay.
And we start, of course, we're looking at studies. At those patients who are Dara and are exposed, we also look at whether there's a possibility to be included in studies using the bispecifics or the CAR T cells.
I want to echo one thing Sonja said, which is so important. We're all big fans of ELO. We really do like using ELO, probably more than others perhaps, but we do like it, and we use it in combination. One of our best platforms has been ELO-PVD, for example, and ELO-PomDex. We've always been very pleased by, especially from a tolerability point of view.
Yeah, and Paul, do you have the data when you give ELO directly following Dara, so you're Dara refractory, and directly you start with ELO-POMD because of lacking NK cells? Do you know, are you gathering those data?
We looked at this. It's very interesting, Sonja. It's a little bit controversial. There's a very nice cohort study from the group in Michigan where they actually looked at this in a more organized fashion, and they did ELO pre-Dara and ELO post-Dara. And interestingly enough, they showed better outcome for sequencing the ELO before the Dara.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And I was struck by that. I would say in our practical experience, we kind of do a mix of both. Frankly, if I've got through Dara failure, ELO-PomDex, I find perhaps asking much. I would put a proteasome inhibitor into that mix with the ELO to help. But I agree with you. It's a very important question. I don't think we've definitive answers. I honestly think one of the most exciting platforms is going to be ELO, hopefully, and a cell mod, after Dara failure, be it iberdomide with Sagar's leadership or with the ELO, or conversely, mezigdomide. Yeah. And
Sagar, you also mentioned DaraPomDex. Because of the data also of DaraPomDex in first line, the Apollo data, they were not that impressive. So we are hardly using DaraPomDex in second line actually.
So I think the problem with the Apollo trial, at least from my view, is that they were much more heavily pretreated. So it's a lines of therapy issue, not necessarily an efficacy issue.
Yeah, but Sagar, I might be wrong, but I think in that trial there were more patients who were receiving DaraPomDex after first line instead of after second, third, or fourth line. When you combine with the ELO-PomDex studies, they were less heavily pretreated, I think.
The Apollo study, the average number of prior lines was 2, whereas with the CAR Dara-Dex, the average number of prior lines was 1. So I think the carfilzomib is being used in a first relapse in both the IKEMA, or in both the ISA and the Dara trials, whereas the POM trials tended to be at least 1 line later.
Yeah,
that's my understanding. Marie, shaking your head. So.
Only the ELO-PomDex. I think only the ELO-PomDex were more heavily. Yeah, the ELO-PomDex were more heavily pretreated.
Yes. And in Icaria, obviously, in contrast to Apollo, in Icaria, we were a median of 3 prior lines, not 2. Yeah. So we were later with Icaria.
And there is another important difference, and it's the len refractory population. In Candor and IKEMA, 35% of the patients were len refractory. In Apollo and in the ELO-PomDex and in the Icaria, over 90% of the patients were len refractory. So I think that this is influencing also in the poor outcome. And concerning DaraPomDex, is true what Sonja said about Apollo, but only 11% of the patients were treated with just one prior line of therapy. And there is another trial in the US, the MM014, in which, well, it is a phase 2, it is approximately 100 patients, but treated with DaraPomDex after just 1 or 2 prior lines of therapy. All of them are len refractory, and the median PFS overall is approximately 30 months, and there is a subgroup of patients that mimic the population from the Apollo, and the outcome is better. The median PFS is 20-something months, so 23, 24. So I think that there is a role for DaraPomDex in first relapse. I agree with what Sagar said. According to their data, well, they put the cutoff of 3 years. I don't know if 3.5 or 2.5, but definitely if the patient has been sensitive to lenalidomide and the patient was on maintenance for many years, I would say that there is not going to be any problem to continue with PomDex Dara. But if the patient relapsed less than 2 years or 2.5 years, for me and in Europe, what we usually do is to switch and to go to carfilzomib plus either isatuximab or carfilzomib.
Yeah, the only thing that's such an interesting concept, just to not to influence the sort of position in the hub, but just as an academic thought, is what we saw, right, Marie-V, with OCEAN, which is where those len-exposed patients still had that propensity to really benefit from the immunogenic effect of their relapse with the POM that followed, whereas, of course, melflufen didn't meet that challenge. And it's really interesting because it suggests in that first relapse len post-transplant, there's this immunogenicity that you can still leverage at that point, at least anyway, with POM, right? Later, maybe a different story as Applebeck and all these other mutational loads start to kick in. But isn't it interesting? Because POM after len post-transplant does appear to behave really quite well. And certainly for the IFM 2009, the majority of patients relapsing after early transplant got a POM-based approach, and that was very interesting because that, of course, impacted on the really, I think, encouraging PFS2s.
Maybe just a comment to.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, maybe just a comment to the ALO DARA sequencing. We also quite like PomDex ALO, especially in patients that have a disease which is not very proliferative, because it's very well tolerated and can actually induce long-term remissions. But I'm also with Sonja that Dara, by its depletion of NK cells, probably will have an impact on a subsequent treatment with elotuzumab. So what we normally do is that we stop Dara for at least 3 or 6 months and then go in with an elo-pom combination. I think what we should also mention is that also selinexor and venetoclax are also available now for patients in second-line therapy for certain patients.
Right, and for the Celi question, we love to drive for those reach for that for 17p. That's particularly interesting, and obviously Celi does partner quite well with POM. Actually, there never are any issues with it. In my experience, anyway, you've got to be a little bit careful with the fatigue, but lower doses of everything, and we use POM plus a PI plus Celi. That's a platform we've had really good luck with in that disease.
Okay, another question that it is being proposed here by Mohamad Mohty, and I think that is important. How do you plan to rescue the elderly patients treated with the Dara-Lendex after a median progression-free survival of 4 or 5 years? Because Paul alluded right now to selinexor, bortezomib and dexamethasone, PVD, KPD. I don't know, what are your suggestions?
I think it's a great question, Mohamad. I think honestly, for the frailer patients, it's all about the frailty and can they handle it, right? I'm very careful in the frail with Celi, despite the Boston results looking so good in the older population. I'm still very cautious about that. But I would also argue that right now, for what we have in the US, ELO is a very interesting platform in the elderly. I think the older patient is all driven by frailty considerations and what they can possibly tolerate. But I think if Dara RD has failed a patient, I would almost always reach for a proteasome inhibitor. In the frailer older patient, carfilzomib is not usually on the table, so a bortezomib-based approach with whatever makes sense. I do actually like POM in the elderly. I think it is doable, but I fully recognize it may not carry the same punch in the elderly as it carries in the younger patient for obvious reasons. And so therefore look at the additional options that are available. But I do like a cytotoxic right now in the US, obviously cyclophosphamide is our go-to, I would say. But the appropriate use of a cytotoxic is also relevant for an older patient if they've not had a cytotoxic exposure earlier.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Any other comment?
I think the idea of POM-Elo-Dex in this is a reasonable idea, and I think Hermann brings up an interesting theoretical concern about the loss of NK cells on DARA-based therapy. We looked at a series of patients who got DARA or they got DARA with an IMiD. And when we looked at NK cell numbers, when you give single agent DARA, NK cells drop pretty dramatically, as I think has been published before. When you combine it with an IMiD, they drop for the first 2 weeks, and then they come up to 50% at the end of that first cycle. And at the end of the second cycle, in combination with an IMiD, they're actually 75% back up to normal. So I think the IMiD-DARA combination counteracts that NK cell depleting effect, because I think the IMiDs are highly effective at this. This is likely even more potent with the cell mods like IBER and MESI. And so I'm less concerned about the sequence if I'm going to give, if I'm going to combine with an IMiD in that context.
Yeah, coming back to Mohamed's question, what to do after DaraPomDex failure. I think even in the elderly, you can go with VPD and use pomalidomide in low dose, 2 milligrams or every. There's a Swiss study which used every other day dosing of pomalidomide in elderly patients, and that worked well. So I think it's still an option. Yeah. VPT.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you refer 4 milligrams of pomalidomide every other day? Heinz?
Yeah, 4 milligram every other day, or you go down to 2 milligram every day.
Yeah, I think we favored continuous dosing with the IMiDs, generally speaking, Marie V, just because of mechanistic lower dose continuous versus syncopated dosing. Just from previous experiences, there was a very interesting work by Bart Barloghi in the very early days of lenalidomide, where he did syncopated dosing of len, and there was less activity, similar toxicity.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and yeah, I was asking this because, well, in the upcoming weeks, a letter will be published based on a clinical trial evaluating exactly this. And I think that this is an important information, and it is feasible, and the efficacy is comparable. Well, just at the last minute, well, do you envision the BCMA targeted therapy in first relapse? And if the answer is yes, well, what would be the most promising BCMA targeted therapy to use in first relapse? If I can start, I think so, because there are different phase 3 clinical trials ongoing, but I would like to know your opinion, and especially because, well, we have just been discussing about carfilzomib, pomalidomide, and so on. What is it going to be the role for carfilzomib and pomalidomide if the BCMA targeted therapy move to the first relapse?
I think it depends, Marie V, all what it looks like, right? I mean, teclistamab obviously is very exciting, but it's 6 days in the hospital all told. It's yeah, and in combination, I guess I take a slightly more strategic view, and I'm not convinced that we'll see teclistamab replace KPD or all the options we just discussed. I think it'll remain a very tailored approach. I honestly think for the frailer, older patient, I really do believe there's been a real important setback with belantamab. I really do. I think I do not understand the thinking, to be honest with you. And I think Bela-based approaches in the frailer patients who are not candidates for teclistamab or CAR-T really, to me, I mean, we've had fantastic results now. We've got a handle on the keratopathy. We combine and we stage interval dosing. So I would have honestly argued Bela would have been more exciting to me in the early relapse, particularly for the frailer elderly. And for example, you just asked what happens after RD Dara fails a patient. I would argue perhaps you think about DaraPomDex, POMVD, something like that could be a very exciting new direction. But anyway, I personally think BCMA, yes, but does it mean that KPD is off the table? All these other drugs are off the table. I really don't think so. It's never one versus the other.
Well, in those who are DARA sensitive, not refractory, you may wish to combine with a bispecific, and that will bring carfilzomib, POM even to a later line, because anti-CD38 and bispecifics are giving some interesting results.
And in addition, I think, Paul, we have several older patients here being treated with teclistamab, and at least in the end, once a month, just to the hospital, with very, very limited side effects. Of course, the infections you see now, but these are patients in later line. So I do think actually that also in the frail patients, it might turn up to be feasible also in earlier lines and really of added value, because well, Dara-Kd, Ida-Kd is also quite challenging for those older patients. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about the bispecifics in earlier lines also for the older patients. No,
I agree. We've had some frailer patients too. I guess my only point is that the other factor, frankly, the gorilla in the room is cost, right? I mean, it's basically 400,000 for 6 months of therapy. This is going to be incredible strain to a lot of healthcare systems, right?
I do agree with that.
And the point is, soon carfilzomib is going to be generic, almost already is. These are going to be real factors in choices.